In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Very nice to be with you here yet again from our office in downtown West Chicago, home of the best international apologetics, theology, and other stuff podcast, right, Chris?
Right, indeed.
Happens to be the only home, so far as we know, to any apologetics podcast. Maybe even only any podcast, for that matter.
West Chicago, you mean?
In West Chicago. Yes, that's right. At any rate, we've got a very intriguing episode for you today, where we are thinking about what for some people is a controversial, perhaps very controversial topic. It's something that piques my interest a little bit as I've studied the doctrine of original sin for my doctoral research. But something that I think Christians should really give pause to consider, especially perhaps if they were raised in a home that emphasized a sort of literal reading of Genesis. And so we are asking a very intriguing question today. Was there death before the fall? And so for this program, this episode today, I've invited Ronald E. Osborne. He is the author of Death Before the Fall, and it was put out by Veracity Press about 5 years or so ago, and it continues to be a talked about book in some circles. And so Ron is the executive director of the John Henry Widener Foundation for Altruism. Ron, did I say that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and you're also the associate professor of ethics and philosophy at La Sierra University. So you, perhaps like myself, wear multiple hats. And before we jump into the conversation, I take it the full professor is sort of a traditional position, but tell me about the Foundation for Altruism that you are overseeing.
Yeah, sure. I'd be delighted to. So the foundation was actually started in 1994 by John Widener and his wife, Naomi Widener. John Widener was a rescuer during World War II. He is the founder, and he was the founder and leader of what came to be known as the Dutch Paris Escape Line, which was a kind of underground network that saved the lives of perhaps as many as 3,000 Jews, downed Allied air pilots, and others who were fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe. So the foundation that I'm a part of is basically dedicated to preserving that history and encouraging action that's in the spirit of John Widener. So something I've been very excited to be a part of for the last few years now. And
having associations with and thinking about, say, suffering, instances of suffering, was also a part of your journey as you thought through the issues about the fall, death and fall, and the fall. So tell us, before we even jump into the book, you do talk about your upbringing. Tell me a little bit about yourself, your backgrounds, and what really got you interested into thinking more about death before the fall.
Sure. Well, I was actually born and raised in the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, which I'm still very much a part of. And the Adventist tradition has long had a concern with questions about theodicy and questions about God's justice. And at the same time, the Adventist tradition has tended towards a fairly literalistic reading of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And so I was raised very much sort of steeped in Adventist creationist apologetics and Adventist sort of biblical literalism. But later on in life, those were hermeneutics that I began to question more, particularly in the light of problems of suffering. So, yeah, that's a little bit about my background. I was raised actually internationally. My parents were missionaries, so I grew up in different parts of
The world.
of the world, of Asia and Africa, Thailand, Taiwan, and Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was kind of where I spent the bulk of my childhood, and I actually begin the book Death Before the Fall by sharing a story from my childhood growing up in Zimbabwe, encountering death in nature in a kind of vivid way for the first time.
Yes, very nice. One of the things that I enjoyed, I try my best, as I do with most of my interviewees, is to read the introduction to their book, see where they're coming from, and to get a short view of sort of what's to come. I really liked what you had to say here in your introduction. You said, readers should be fairly warned from the outset that I offer few confident answers to the problem of animal suffering in the manner of some Christian apologists. You continue on a bit further on. The ideas presented in these pages are offered in open-ended exploratory form based on the belief that partial answers do exist. And I think that speaks highly of, one's intellectual humility, that they're really striving for truth, as our tagline of the show goes, but that maybe we don't have all the answers. But here are some possibilities, or maybe here are some answers that we do know. And so I really appreciate your approach to the topic at hand, because you have this sort of willingness to say, hey, let's see where this takes us. Now,
thank you for saying that. I have to confess that some readers have actually come away from the book thinking that my intentions are more polemical or something, because I do have some fairly critical things to say in the book about certain positions that I no longer hold. But I really have tried my best throughout the book to remain open as much as I can, and to emphasize that we're all there are enough problems to go around for all of us. So
I call theology a pick your poison field. I study theology formally, and there's no perfect position. And I don't just say that because, some people might say that sort of in an abstract way, but really there are challenges and difficulties to any position one might take, and just a matter of which mess do you want to deal with. So, absolutely. In your first chapter, you talk about the creation, and really, sort of in the first section of your book, you deal with the traditional literistic or literal reading of the creation account and the account of the fall. So, I sort of want to just throw it out to you here to explain what is sort of the literal approach. And maybe what are some of the shortcomings that you find to that position?
Sure. Well, maybe I should back up a little bit and first just share with you a little bit more about the genesis of this book. This book was written around, most of the chapters in this book were written around 2010, 2011, in the midst of very heated conversations within my own confessional faith community around the question of creation. And mostly at the time, I'm not a scientist by training, nor a theologian by training. I'm actually a political scientist by background. And as I was kind of listening to the way that people were talking, I just kept thinking to myself, no, it's not that easy, or it's not that clean cut. It's not that simple. And so at a certain point, I began to write things here and there, mostly for an online magazine called Spectrum Magazine, that were really kind of in reaction to the really dogmatic, almost strident voices that I was hearing. And out of that, I ended up having a variety of things that kind of were all in various ways tackling the problem of suffering and the debate about creation and evolution. And I started to think, well, maybe I have enough material here to actually make a book out of it. So the book ended up being is a kind of eclectic mix of different reflections and essays and responses to this kind of debate going on. It wasn't that I sat down and had a book in mind from the very beginning. And so So the book is not like a really systematic theology or anything like of that nature. It really is more like occasional essays that are all revolving around certain themes. And basically, a real turning point for me in my own thinking about creation and evolution was a thought that I don't know why it had never occurred to me previously in my life, but it was a thought that when it finally struck me, it made me realize that that what I had grown up to believe was a tidy solution to the suffering problem with animals was actually not a solution. And once I saw that, it kind of opened the door for me to start thinking in new ways. And so, but that's kind of jumping ahead to the second half of the book. The first half of the book that you asked me about had to do with, what are some of the critiques of the traditional way of reading the story, and what is that traditional way? And well, for one thing, I don't think it is a traditional way, except with a very short view of history, because this kind of the literalism that we now associate with contemporary creationism is not really historically grounded, and that's something I point out in the first half of the book. If you go way back to the church fathers and fairly early Christian thinkers, there were lots of people who were reading the book of Genesis in ways that don't sound at all like modern day creationism or fundamentalism. And so they had a variety of ways of doing this. And now one of the interesting things, or almost ironic things, is that when you look at someone like St. Augustine, he has a book that's the title of the book is The Literal Meaning of Genesis.
Yes.
So he uses the word literal in there. He believes that Genesis is literal, but what literal means for him is very different than what it means to us. He doesn't read it as being a strict scientific or chronological account. He doesn't believe that creation happened in 6 literal 24-hour periods. So he reads the book of Genesis literally, but that does not mean literal in the way that it has come to mean today.
Right. Yes.
So, yeah.
I was going to say, so Augustine's work I was familiar with because I cited it a number of times in my chapter that I wrote on his view of original sin. Yeah. So I'm familiar with that. And you're right. So when I say the word traditional, I don't mean to convey, I myself don't mean to convey this is the view of the Christian church for 2,000 years. I guess I mean to convey something like traditional American evangelicalism, which has a short history, relatively speaking.
Yeah, and so that's part of the answer to your question, which is, for me, one of the things that was important for me to look at was what did earlier Christians think about these problems, not just evangelical American Christians, and then trying to reconnect with that long, deep history of Christian thought that goes way back 2,000 years. And not only Christian thought, by the way, also I think Jewish thought is significant in how, when we wrestle with these questions.
Sure.
And so that's part of what's going on in the first half of the book is looking at these, trying to look at these questions with from the long view of history, not just our more shortened kind of time frame of the past, 100 years or something.
Yeah.
Additionally, I
was going to say, so what is it for many people that do take a literal approach? They seem, in many ways, passionately against the non-literal interpretations. What do you think? Why do you think that is? That there is this fierce response? Because as I'm sure you've experienced a strong pushback from within your own denomination, much less the fact that there are others out there in other denominations that operate the same way.
Yeah, and actually there may be a bridge there or a link because the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, which is not very well known or well understood within sort of larger evangelical circles, in many ways had a kind of outsized influence on the rest of the evangelical world in spreading creationist ideas. And this was really via the work of this individual named George McCready Price, who he wrote some books. He was kind of a self-taught guy. He didn't have really formal training in science, but he was kind of self-taught, and he advanced these ideas about what he called flood geology, and had a big influence on people around the 1920s and thereabouts, including William Jennings Bryan in the infamous Scopes so-called monkey trial of 1925.
Right.
Bryan basically picked up on some of George McCready Price's writings and even quoted from them in the trial. But then in 1961, these two non-Adventists, John Whitcomb and Henry Morris, wrote a book, 1961, called The Genesis Flood, which really catapulted creationist ideas into the minds of millions of evangelicals in America and led to the rise of organizations like Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research. Well, the interesting thing is that Whitcomb and Morris both actually were inspired directly by reading George McCready Price. And so there is this kind of interesting itinerary where Seventh-day Adventists basically made these arguments for literal creation that got picked up on by other evangelicals and then entered the mainstream. If you go further, if you go back though to the early period of biblical inerrancy and biblical fundamentalism, the interesting thing is that a lot of those thinkers actually were not very worried about embracing evolutionary ideas. So, for example, Princeton theologian B.B. Warfield, he basically said that there was nothing in Genesis that opposed evolution. Another was George Wright, who was one of the writers of the original commentaries called the Fundamentals, which kind of marked the rise of the fundamentalist movement. And George Wright actually endorsed the day-age theory of creation. So each day in Genesis represented a long period of time.
Yeah.
So that was kind of like early thinking in fundamentalist circles was actually not even particularly worried about this question. But then over time it became a bigger deal. I don't know. You'd probably have to go to somebody else to really better understand this whole history and why evangelicalism took that kind of turn. Maybe someone like Ron Numbers, his book The Creationist is kind of a standard history for creationist movement.
Sure. Well, I feel like I've still gotten a good starter here with that history.
Yeah, I mean, I could certainly talk to you about why Adventism in particular was very concerned about literal creationism. Part of it had to do with Adventist apologetics for the importance of the seventh-day Sabbath as the correct day of worship. As you may know, Adventists worship on Saturday rather than Sunday.
Right.
And there was a concern that if you didn't have a literal creation week, then it would somehow undermine the significance of having a literal Sabbath day on which to worship.
Right. Yeah, somehow being the critical word there.
Yeah, and I use that word somehow because, of course, in Judaism, it's never been a problem.
Right.
There have been non-literal readings of Genesis 1 in Judaism for thousands of years now, and obviously it has never prevented the Jewish tradition from worshiping on the Sabbath. So I'm not sure why the theology of Sabbath keeping should be directly tied to a literal creation week. But anyways, those are kind of peculiar, unique concerns of the Adventist tradition, and so through this kind of winding path, it's become a large concern among lots of Christians, like you say.
Yeah. Now, for you, when you were along your personal journey, being raised in this tradition, what sort of clued you in? Like, hey, maybe the way I was taught was mistaken. What were some of the arguments, perhaps information or arguments that you were thinking about, and maybe even now, what are some arguments you look to? From looking through your book, I saw one that like stood out to me in particular, where you're going through sort of the mathematics behind it. Like, hey, if Adam had to name all the animals, within that time period, I mean, it just wouldn't work.
Right. Well, so that particular part of the book, so if you're a very strict, I don't even like using the word literal or literalist, because I kind of feel like literalists literally get it wrong. But
yeah, they're not literalist enough.
Exactly. I mean, I think if we take Genesis literally, we would not read it scientifically, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons I argue for that is because it seems that just by a kind of plain surface reading, Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 offer quite different chronologies of what's happening during their respective creation weeks. And if you try to somehow reconcile them on scientific grounds rather than on theological grounds, you end up having to do some really elaborate gymnastics. So, on the sixth day of the week, Adam is created, and then he discovers that he's alone or he's lonely, and then all the animals have to subsequently be created and brought past him. He has to name them all, and he's immediately put back to sleep. And then Eve is created, and then he's immediately raised back up again. It starts to almost sound comically absurd. And that's, but those are the gymnastics you have to go through if you're trying to make it all fit scientifically. Mm-hmm. And I think it begs a really important question, which is, why do people feel that it must be made to work scientifically? And I think that one of the real ironies is of this kind of creationism, this kind of attempt to make Genesis speak to us in a scientific way. I think one of the great ironies is that people who are committed to that project think of themselves as opposing modern materialistic, atheistic, scientific naturalism or something like that,
sure,
right?
Sure.
But in fact, it seems like they have a very modernist kind of obsession with science. And, because we live in an age in which scientific truth is held up as being the paramount truth and the most authoritative form of knowledge in our culture, And so there seems to be a response among some Christians to therefore say, well, therefore the Bible has to be a scientific book because it has to be the highest kind of authority, right? But in a way, that's just paying homage to modern science and the power that it exercises over our worldviews.
Yeah, right.
Maybe that's not the intent of the book at all, and maybe instead of trying to make the Bible, read to answer all of our scientific questions, we should kind of readjust what we think is most important, because there are other ways of accessing truth other than through science. So,
right, and I know we're not going into the minutia per se of some of the arguments and thoughts you present, but there were things that I had never even considered from someone of your earlier perspective. So, for example, you mentioned that. Why is it that animals had sharp claws? That God created them with sharp claws. Well, it wouldn't have been for killing. It would have been for scratching tree bark. And I just, even though some of us had been raised in that literal tradition, we perhaps never even thought of the implications of that view that we would have to hold to such a position. And it would just bring about these complexities and, in some ways, absurdities. And then as you go through, you sort of lead the reader to realize, then how is God responsible for all of a sudden the animals now killing as a result of the curse. That's, I think it's just something that folks don't give credence to when they think about these important issues. And you've, in that respect, done your due diligence.
Well, that was for me kind of the pivot point, the turning point. It was when this thought kind of just dawned on me, and I don't know why I hadn't really thought about it before, but it was when it just dawned on me that whether you're a creationist who believes in, creation 6,000 years ago or something, or if you're a theistic evolutionist who believes that everything got started 14 billion years ago or with the Big Bang or something like that, whichever of these positions you hold, you still have a dilemma when it comes to the theodicy problem, because the reality is right now, all around us, pervasively throughout the entire animal kingdom, we have animals preying on other animals, and animals that seem to be perfectly adapted for predation and carnivorousness. And that extends all the ways from the kind of apex predators at the top of the food chain, the lions and the sharks and things like that, right down to, almost microscopic parasites. And so the question becomes, well, how on earth did these creatures become this way? And it seems to me that you have only a very few number of options in answer to that question. And, the standard answer that people give is, well, it's because of the fall. They were, things are this way now because of Adam and Eve's rebellion and their sin, right?
Yeah.
But the question is, well, how does that solve the theodicy dilemma? How does that resolve the question of animal suffering? Because it doesn't seem that there's any direct line between human beings, eating fruit, and suddenly lions having sharp talons and canine teeth.
Yeah.
The one doesn't logically lead to the other. So there still has to be some causal explanation for the transformation. And so what is it that causes the transformation? And so at that point, you're left with, it seems to me, basically three choices. Either you can say that God supernaturally transformed these animals, or you can say that they were transformed supernaturally by a demonic power. The devil did it.
Okay. Yep.
Or you can say, well, they were transformed naturalistically. They evolved somehow.
Yeah.
And there are dilemmas with each of those three answers. If you say that the devil did it and that all of the animal world is basically supernaturally, miraculously almost transformed, then you're basically ceding a huge amount of God's creation to the devil, and it almost swerves into a kind of Gnostic theology where the material world around us is evil instead of God's good creation. You're basically giving satanic power a lot of sway over the creation in a way that the Genesis narratives never really suggest very strongly.
Let me, if I may, let me play devil's advocate here. So, isn't the devil referred to as the prince of this world? So maybe he has some authority.
Oh yeah, undoubtedly. But I think the question remains with regard to creation. Do we find evidence of that in Scripture, of a supernatural transformation of the animal kingdom that makes creatures that were formerly, docile and peaceful animals into suddenly, carnivorous creatures? I just don't know what text exactly you would point to. If anything, I would say that the biblical evidence kind of strongly supports the opposite view. One of the things that I think Christians forget is that there's not just one creation account in the Bible. There's actually multiple creation narratives in different parts of Scripture. So, Psalm 104 is a creation narrative, and it includes descriptions of lions. Not just lions, but lions on the hunt. and there's no hint in it in Psalms 104 of that being wicked or bad. In fact, far from it. It seems like God is celebrating his creation,
Yeah.
Another would be the final chapters of the book of Job.
Yeah.
Where God, when God speaks from out of the whirlwind and says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" That's a creation narrative that then unfolds, and he basically talks about his creation, and it doesn't sound like it's particularly, domesticated creation. It's ferocious. It's wild. He talks about creating these great sea monsters, the Leviathan and the behemoth.
Yeah, right.
And there's something about that account in Job that I think is very important for Christians as a corrective to a certain kind of domesticated reading of Genesis chapter 1, because I think a lot of Christians have theologies of creation taken almost entirely from Genesis 1, where Adam and Eve are basically represented as being the pinnacle of creation, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have this high place. They are the ones who are uniquely created in God's own image, and they represent the culmination of the creation week. And that's great, but if taken alone, I think it has the danger of leading to a kind of anthropocentric kind of view of our place in God's creation,
Yeah.
And I think there's a necessary balance to that in the book of Job, where God's creation is vastly beyond human comprehension, and it's not kind of something that can be cut down to human expectations or human needs or something like that. It's actually something that far exceeds our kind of finite, very small human place in the cosmic scheme of things.
Yep. Good.
And so somehow holding those two ideas in tension is, I think, what is necessary. I'm not saying forget one and go with the other. I'm saying that both are part of the biblical vision of creation.
Yeah. Nice. Ron, we've got to take a break here. When we'll come back, though, we will continue exploring these intriguing ideas and sort of a step back from perhaps the way many traditional American evangelicals have been thinking about the creation narratives, if they've been aware of, even, as you say, these other passages in Scripture which lend to that theme or motif. So stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, but have trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Licona, Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill podcast with Kurt Jarris, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888, and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. All right, thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you'd like to learn how you can become a sponsor, you can go to our website, click on the sponsor button there, and there are different options. We'd love to get your support for our program to help keep us going and growing, a number of different sponsorship levels. Or if you just want to become one of our patrons, you can donate, whether it be $5, $10, or $20 a month. We'd love to get your support of our program. And if you're a fan of the show, please be sure to give us a review on iTunes, the Google Play Store, or really on Facebook, where we've had most of our things. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we have been actively working on uploading all of our programs, and we love coming soon to be streaming to you. All right, well, on today's program, we are joined by Ron Osborne. He is the author of Death Before the Fall, which has been a controversial book in its own right for some people. For others, perhaps not as controversial. A number of Old Testament figures I see that have endorsed your work here, Ron, and spoken highly of it, and that must be a high honor, especially as you mentioned, you're not an Old Testament scholar by training, a theologian in any respect, but these are things that you've been thinking about for many years, and through the process in your own denomination gave rise to some writings which ultimately came to form into this book. Now, in the first half of the program, we sort of got introduced to some of these ideas about difficulties with the more literal approach, and Ron noted that perhaps they aren't really literalistic because they don't go far enough in their readings. But where we left off, Ron, we were talking about sort of some of the different approaches one might have to take to understanding the fall. And what resulted in animals becoming carnivorous. And you then also mentioned here something I took down in my notes about how humans might be viewing things very anthropocentric. And so let me ask you this. So on your view, would you say that, at least the way I was raised, humans are the sort of capstone of creation. And so, on your view, do you think that humans could continue to evolve into, and this is I guess more a scientific question for you, and I'm not sure if you have a view, so that's why I'm curious. Could humans continue to evolve and then become a different species eventually down the line?
Oh, I have not really thought much about that question, but I don't really see us evolving anytime soon into some new kind of creature or being. And I'm also, by the way, very, very. I think Christians should be very skeptical about some of these projects by some people who, you've probably heard the terms transhumanism, the idea that humans can kind of take control of their own evolutionary trajectory and somehow escape their human limitations and become something superior, whether that's through
gene editing,
genetic manipulation, or through merging technology, using technology or something. Well, okay, all of that kind of stuff I'm very, very skeptical of. And I actually wrote another book which is titled Humanism and the Death of God, which was published this past year by Oxford, and it's a book that is a critique of certain kinds of atheistic humanism that, anyways, so I'm not trying to promote another book on your show, but the long and short of it is that in that book, I say some things that are very critical of a kind of ultra Darwinism and, or Darwinianism, and some things that would be, some readers might be surprised when they read Death Before the Fall, where I'm really critiquing biblical literalism. They might think, well, I'm just a gung-ho evolutionist or something. Mm-hmm. But if you read my other book, you'll find me issuing what I think is a quite robust critique of Darwinism as well. So,
And as a complete non-scientist, gosh, the last science class I took was freshman year at Biola University, and I don't even think I got an A in that class. So as a non-science person, it's been my observation as someone interested in apologetics and related issues, winsome apologetics, I should say, that there are coming out more critiques, even from non-Christians, on Darwinian and neo-Darwinian approaches to understanding, human biology and how we got here. And I don't know, again, where you stand, and there are, of course, different sub-camps in all these debates. But so you say that, you have some criticisms there. So what's been sort of, if you could, be what's that terminology? A bellwether? Is that the right term? Where you're putting your feeler out for the weather on the state of that debate. What has that been like?
Honestly, I haven't been, especially since writing this book, I haven't really been following closely the debates between people in the Christian community around creation and evolution.
Okay.
But I can tell you the kinds of thinkers who have been most helpful to me. One of my favorite theologians at the moment is David Bentley Hart.
Yeah.
Who, Eastern Orthodox theologian. He has a book called The Experience of God, which is a terrific book, and I think is a good model for Christians of how to engage with these kinds of questions. And one of the things that Hart does in that book is he critiques. He's a very strong critic of a kind of philosophical naturalism that is. Basically blissfully lacking in self-awareness when it comes to its own metaphysical and philosophical assumptions. And he does a great job critiquing, naturalism as being logically incoherent, really. But at the same time, in that book, he has some passages where he is very critical as well of a certain kind of creationism, or even like the intelligent design movement. And I think that his critique of these attempts to shore up one's Christianity using scientific types of proofs or arguments is that in a certain way they are actually succumbing to the very thing that they claim to be resisting.
Interesting. Now, I was going to say, lest we go too far into his thought, that seems like a good segue to ask you about the fourth chapter in your book here, titled Progressive versus Degenerating Science. Seems a bit related here. So there are these different paradigms in the Christian community. As you'd mentioned, there's, intelligent design is sort of one paradigm. You've got your literal, if we can call it that, literal paradigm, which carries with it, flood geology, this own terminology of a different way of viewing a subfield of, within science. And then you've got sort of theistic evolution there. Those are sort of the three main camps. I don't know if there are any other ones out there. So in your view, though, what makes an approach, sort of progress or progressive versus approaches to science which sort of take us back?
Well, I accept scientific methodologies on really their own terms. I think that Christians should not be afraid of science. I think that Christians should embrace what scientists have to tell us, including about questions of origins. I think that we should not be afraid of the idea of deep time. That the universe is billions of years old. All of that I accept. I also accept the idea of common ancestry. So none of this is problematic to me. I think where science gets it wrong is when it kind of evolves from being a methodological tool into being a metaphysical prejudice. So when you have scientists whose materialist methodology then becomes a larger claim about all of reality, well, they're no longer really doing science. That's metaphysics.
Right. Yeah. And
that is.
I was going to say, I certainly agree with that. In my studies of New Testament scholarship, you see folks that think, well, historians can't get into miracles, and so that at that point, are they really doing history anymore, or are they making or carrying philosophical baggage into their methodology? So I certainly understand there where, like you said, you get folks carrying that over and they're no longer doing science, or they're infusing their epistemology with metaphysical claims.
Yeah, so for me, that's kind of the point at which the discussion is most interesting, and the point at which, and that's the place where I think Christians need to engage. But as far as valid, legitimate scientific work goes, I think that it's a terrible mistake when Christians try to shore up their Christian worldview using certain kinds of defensive, apologetic, scientific moves, essentially trying to beat science at its own game. And time and again, that kind of effort has fallen short, I think. And so, if there are scientists out there who happen to be believers who are dedicated to trying to use their tools and their methods to prove flood geology or a young Earth creationist kind of paradigm, well, my reaction is more power to them. They're, go at it. But I think we have to be honest that to date, the scientific evidence does not seem to support what they're arguing for. And to me, that shouldn't be a faith-shattering kind of conclusion for a Christian to make,
Let me ask you this, sort of going broad, if I may. Does it seem, if there's animal suffering before the fall, is that just a hard pill that some people have to swallow in uncomfortable position? We have to just say, yep, that's the way that God brought it about, but that's part of the beautiful ecosystem.
Well, I want to go back to the conversation we were having earlier because, I had mentioned to you earlier that there were these three possible solutions to the problem of animal suffering in the present, right?
Yep.
One was a naturalistic answer, one was a demonic answer, and one would be a divine answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, for the reasons I stated earlier, it's just not, for me, theologically sound to try to explain the world as we know it on demonic, supernatural tampering with matter,
Sure.
I don't think that's, to me, like I say, that verges on Gnosticism, where you have kind of like an evil creator God who and you attribute and then you attribute the creation as we see it to this God, and the whole goal is to get off this planet to somewhere else, right?
Yep.
So for me, that's just it's not only it doesn't only beg credulity for any kind of serious, thoughtful person in the world today. I think it also is theologically unsound. And so the alternative, the other alternative would be the naturalistic one, where you say, well, everything evolved just in a somewhat natural way, even maybe through a process of evolution. And so you ended up with lions developing predatory instincts and having predatory tools. And the same for sharks, I guess. Same for crocodiles, and on and on.
Or even, while we think of the big dangerous animals, even insects that eat other insects. You are talking about God's creatures eating God's other creatures.
Yeah. So that's another path. And I think that one of the one of the quandaries there for creationists is that creationists have oftentimes made a big deal about saying that there's not enough time for evolution to have happened. And yet suddenly we're being told that we need to embrace an almost like hyper-accelerated evolution that almost immediately results in all these creatures becoming predators, in this kind of way. Not only predatory in their instincts, but perfectly adapted to predation in their anatomy, in their physiology, and everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. So the tigers go from having flattened teeth to sharpened teeth.
Right. And this happens, as far as the biblical record is concerned, it would have to be instantaneous because we have predatory animals being described very early on in the book,
Yeah, yeah.
So how and it's, of course, it really starts to stretch things when for the strictest of young Earth creationists, the kinds of people who subscribe to Ussher's chronology, where you would have essentially the world is only approximately 6,000 years old. I mean, that's especially problematic if you have that kind of a time frame, right?
Yeah.
But in any case, this is still giving a tremendous amount of power to the natural world, which I guess in itself isn't a terrible problem, but whether you take this naturalistic approach where you say, well, the creation became adapted this way somehow, or if you take the even stronger view, the final alternative, which is to say, well, God supernaturally transformed the creation. And some people use the language of curse, referring to the language in Genesis where it talks about God cursing the ground. For some Christians, they actually go far beyond what the text says, and they say, well, God cursed all the animals. Now, the Bible doesn't actually say that, right? It says that he cursed the ground. It doesn't talk about him cursing animals, but some Christians infer that and say, well, the creation in its entirety must have been cursed by God and then therefore supernaturally transformed. Well, whichever of those two approaches you take, the naturalistic one or the kind of supernatural intervention, it seems to me that both of those paths don't actually solve the problem of animal suffering at all. In fact, they actually greatly amplify it. They make the problem worse. And the reason they make the problem worse is because they basically pin the problem of animal suffering directly on God. Adam and Eve sin, and therefore God punishes animals. Well, how does that address our concerns about divine justice in any way? And the analogy I give in the book would be like, imagine if you had some kids and you told your kids, hey, don't play with the stove, it can burn you. And the kids go ahead and play with the stove, and you say, right, you need to learn a lesson. You need to know that the stoves are hot. So watch this, I'm going to put the family cat on the stove.
Right. Yeah. What does the animal have to do with the human's actions?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The animal is now, your child is going to learn something for sure. They're going to learn that the stove is hot, but they're also going to learn that you're a monster. So the problem remains. The theodicy problem persists for everyone. There simply is there's no solution to the theodicy problem that really is going to be completely clear and satisfactory, whether you're a theistic evolutionist or a 6,000-year-old Earth creationist.
Right, I gotcha. So for people, if they feel like animal suffering before the fall is unjust, you would say, well, wait a second. It seems to be unjust no matter which way you take it. There's no person that's on moral high ground here in terms of the theological, take on it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the theodicy problem is just not solved in any way, shape, or form, as far as I can tell, by literalism.
Yeah,
it's
interesting.
And in certain ways, I would argue it's actually amplified, because if you're a theistic evolutionist, you might have a view that says, in some sense, one of the things that God creates when God creates is freedom, or a kind of world in which God is not fully in control of everything, because in order for things to be free, God has to allow for them to have sort of
a sufficient sense
capacity,
of freedom. Right.
Yeah, some capacity for development and so on. And so maybe, that to me in some ways can be at least a somewhat more satisfying answer, that we have a world that includes predatory processes and animals that are a certain way, because God has created a universe that also contains indeterminacy. God isn't, as you can tell from the way I'm talking, I'm not a Calvinist, right?
Yeah.
But
neither am I, by the way. So it's, I agree with you.
Okay, then maybe we're, so in other words, if you're not a Calvinist, you can envision a creation that is actually a kind of unfolding process in which God leaves open, in some sense, possibilities for the created order without being directly responsible for everything that happens.
Yep.
And I don't know, I'm not saying that this is a tidy or neat solution to the problem, but for me, it's a little bit better solution than any of the other three that I named to you, that God is supernaturally cursing and transforming the creation, in which case God is directly responsible,
Yeah.
Or even the other two, which are more passive, like, well, God just kind of walks away from it and lets the devil take over, or something like that.
Sure. Yeah. Good. Ron, this has been an engaging discussion. We're already coming up short on our time here. I feel like I could keep going for another hour with you. But it's been a lot. It's been a lot of fun for me. Before we let you go, let me ask you this. So 2 things. One, you would have not have killed any animals before the fall if you were there, because you are a vegetarian.
So I'm just Kurt. I'm just a vegetarian because I find it easier sneaking up on vegetables. Okay.
Yes, right. Well, I guess that would be easier. but let me. I'm really curious about this. So you participated in an ultimate frisbee tournament in North Korea, like North Korea, not South Korea. In North Korea. Tell me about that. I mean, I think you're probably the only guest. I've been doing this program for over 3 years. You're probably the only guest I've had, and possibly the only American I know that has set foot on North Korean soil.
Yeah, that was back in 2012. It was a good time. Spent about a week there with a group of about 20 guys, and we went over to do a kind of goodwill sports diplomacy thing, and played ultimate frisbee for about a week with North Koreans, and taught school kids how to play frisbee. And it was really interesting because we discovered that pretty much no one in North Korea has ever even seen a frisbee.
Oh my gosh!
It was, yeah.
Oh wow! They haven't even seen a frisbee. Oh.
That's what we were told by our guides, and everywhere we went, we would take the frisbee with us. We would find ourselves in the main square there in Pyongyang, where they have the military parades, where the the big missile trucks come rolling through and all. We would be out there playing frisbee right in that square.
Wow!
And people would be watching us, and you could see people kind of eyeing you, and trying to avoid looking like they're looking at you.
Yeah.
And so you just toss them the frisbee, and then they just break out laughing, and they immediately want to start playing with you. So
yeah, because wow, I mean, I don't want to be like over stereotypical here, but like, they realized they wouldn't get shot if they started playing ultimate frisbee.
The thing about North Korea that I found really interesting and striking was, there are such stereotyped images of North Korea in the American media, but when you go over there, you realize that people are people, and that's not an apology in any way, shape, or form for the brutal North Korean military regime dictatorship.
Right.
But still, I think it's good for Americans to understand and realize that in North Korea, even there are people who love their kids and have families, and
Yep.
and who appreciate a good joke and will smile if you smile at them, and so. So it was for me a good experience going over and actually just encountering North Koreans as more like people than we sometimes see in the media.
Yep. Very nice. Good. Ronald, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. For those that are interested, we'll put a link at our website here for Death Before the Fall, Biblical Literalism, and the Problem of Animal Suffering. Intriguing thoughts. Thank you for your efforts. And Ron, I'm sure you knew that you would get flack for it. So I think in that respects, it speaks to your courage as well to get a book like this published out there. So,
hey, I really appreciate it. And, for your listeners, I just want to say the purpose of the book is not to convert anyone to a particular point of view, but I hope it gives people just another perspective, some ideas and things to think about.
Yep. Ron, I've got to sign off here, but if you could stay on the line for me, I'd love to chat with you afterward.
Sounds great. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Well, that does it for our program today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons and the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, and the Illinois Family Institute, and Fox Restoration. I want to thank our technical producer, Chris, for all the fine work that he does week in, week out. To our guest today, Ron Osborne, again, for this wonderful book that you should check out and consider and think through, if you don't agree with Ron, if only to understand the other side. That can be very helpful. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.